Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to drop a quick comment saying where you're watching from or what other World War II topics you'd like to see me cover. It is one of history's most haunting ironies that the man who planned the most audacious attack on American soil was also the man who predicted it would doom the Japanese. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto wasn't merely a naval strategist, he was a witness to American might in the industrial age. Decades before the first Zero fighter lifted off a carrier deck, Yamamoto had served as a naval attaché in Washington. During his time in this role, he had ridden trains across the vast American continent, watched the oil gush from the derricks in Texas, and stood on the factory floors of Detroit. There, amidst the roar of assembly lines and the smoke of blast furnaces, he saw the terrible arithmetic of modern war. He understood then what the hardliners in Tokyo refused to accept, that courage cannot defeat physics, and that spirit cannot stop a production line that runs 24 hours a day. When the Prime Minister asked him in 1940 about the prospects of a war with the Anglo-American powers, Yamamoto didn't offer the comforting platitudes of a loyal soldier. Instead, he offered a chillingly precise schedule of doom. He told the Prime Minister that if ordered to fight, he would have great success for the first 6 months, perhaps even a year, securing a string of stunning victories. But he warned that if the war dragged on beyond that opening gambit, he had absolutely no expectation of success. He knew that once the American giant woke up and converted those auto plants into tank factories and those oil fields into aviation fuel, Japan would be crushed. He said that the Americans possessed superior logistics beyond what the Japanese could even dream of. Long before the attack on Pearl Harbor was even a tactical blueprint, the Japanese government possessed a secret weapon that should have stopped the war before it began. This was the Total War Research Institute, and despite its name, it was established to act as a rational check on the fiery ambitions of the military. In the fall of 1941, just months before the outbreak of hostilities, the Institute produced a simulation of a potential conflict with the United States and Great Britain. The findings were beyond just pessimistic, and they predicted absolute utter catastrophe. The analysts ran the numbers on shipping tonnage, oil reserves, steel production, and bauxite imports. They simulated the flow of resources from the southern resource area, the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, that the Army planned to seize. The report concluded that while Japan might seize these territories, it lacked the merchant marine capacity to transport the resources back to the home islands. The simulation predicted that American submarines and aircraft would ravage Japanese shipping lanes, severing the jugular of the empire. The Institute warned that Japan's material strength would peak almost immediately, and then begin a precipitous decline, while American industrial output would grow exponentially. They estimated that the tipping point would occur roughly 2 years into the conflict, after which the disparity would become unmanageable. This was a calculation based on the known output of American steel mills and the known consumption rates of the Imperial Navy. However, when this report was presented to the liaison conferences, the high-level meetings between the government and the military high command, it was met with hostility. General Hideki Tojo, then the war minister, and his faction viewed the data not as a warning to be heeded, but as an obstacle to be overcome by spiritual fortitude. They argued that the analysts were ignoring the intangible factors of war, the unique Japanese spirit, the unity of the people, and the willingness to sacrifice. This isn't an exaggeration. Tojo legitimately thought that the quote-unquote Yamato spirit would crush America. This was despite the fact that Tojo didn't dispute that. On paper, this was a David and Goliath situation. The report was suppressed, its authors marginalized, and the government chose to proceed with a bizarre and audacious strategy. They would strike hard, seize all the resources they could, and then hoped that the United States, demoralized by the blow, would negotiate a peace. It was a strategy built on the psychological assessment of an enemy they didn't truly understand, while simultaneously ignoring all the data. At the same time, the army was drunk on the successes of its campaigns in China and the allure of political dominance. The Imperial Japanese Navy was simultaneously suffering. The Navy was the service that had to fight the Americans across the vastness of the Pacific, and its leaders were technocrats who understood the risks. Admiral Osami Nagano, the chief of the Naval General Staff, and his subordinates were acutely aware of the oil problem. Japan imported over 80% of its oil, the vast majority of it from the United States. The American embargo imposed in 1941 had started a countdown clock. Every day the fleet sat at anchor. It burned fuel it couldn't replace. The Navy agreed to the war, not because they believed they could win a protracted conflict, but because they believed they would slowly asphyxiate if they did nothing. Yamamoto's strategy for Pearl Harbor was born of this desperation. He didn't design the attack to conquer America. He designed it to buy time. He hoped that by shattering the Pacific Fleet, he could create a small window of opportunity in which Japan could force terms on a demoralized American populace. But privately, Yamamoto remained despondent. Letters he wrote to friends during this period reveal a man who felt he was being ordered to destroy Japan. He knew that if the Americans refused to negotiate, if they got angry instead of scared, the war was lost before the first ship left harbor. And unlike the vast majority of Japanese, Yamamoto had lived in America. He knew that the Americans possessed a rugged national character, and like the Japanese also took honor seriously. While he didn't outright say it, he in essence knew that the insane plan he hatched was doomed to fail, because he knew Americans too well. For the first 6 months of 1942, it appeared that the hardliners were right and the math was wrong. The Japanese military machine swept across the Pacific with terrifying speed. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, they all fell like dominoes. The British Empire's fortress at Singapore, thought to be impregnable, surrendered to a numerically inferior Japanese force. To the Japanese, this was clear confirmation of the superior nature of the national character of their people versus the weak and decadent Westerners. The illusion of invincibility took hold of the nation, and rational thought went out the window. The public was euphoric, fed a steady diet of propaganda that portrayed the Americans and British as soft, decadent, and incapable of fighting a warrior nation. This phenomenon, later diagnosed by historians and Japanese officials alike as the victory disease, blinded the leadership to the underlying fragility of their position. They extended their defensive perimeter far beyond what their logistics could support, convinced that the enemy was on the ropes. But the technocrats in the logistics bureaus knew better. Even during these victories, the merchant marine was losing ships faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The resource flow from the south was already trickling rather than flooding, hampered by inefficiency and the nascent American submarine threat. The clock struck midnight on the Japanese Dream in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. In the span of a single day, the Imperial Navy lost 4 of its 6 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Also critically, they lost the cream of their Naval Aviation Corps. These were pilots who had trained for hundreds of hours, veterans of the China War and the Pearl Harbor attack. The reaction of the Imperial General Headquarters to this catastrophe set a pattern of deception that would doom the Japanese war effort. Instead of confronting the disaster and adjusting their strategy, they buried it. The defeat was classified as a top-secret state affair. The surviving sailors and airmen who returned to Japan weren't greeted as heroes or comforted as wounded veterans. They were treated like carriers of a plague. They were isolated in hospital wards, forbidden from contacting their families, and strictly monitored to ensure they did not spread the truth of the defeat. The government released a communiqué claiming a great victory, admitting only to the loss of one carrier, while claiming to have decimated the American fleet. Even Prime Minister Tojo was kept in the dark about the full extent of the losses for weeks. The emperor was informed in a private audience, but he too participated in the cover-up, instructing the naval leaders that this news must not be allowed out. Communication between the Navy and the Army was almost non-existent, and the Army was kept in the dark about the true nature of the losses. This conspiracy of silence meant that the Army continued to plan its operations based on the assumption of naval support that no longer existed. The Navy knew the offensive war was over. They had lost the initiative, and given the disparity in shipbuilding capacity, they knew they would never get it back. The Americans could build replacement carriers in parallel in a matter of months. For Japan, a single carrier would take years. If Midway was the tactical turning point, the campaign for Guadalcanal was the strategic confirmation that the Total War Research Institute had been right all along. For 6 months, from August 1942 to February 1943, Japan and the United States poured resources into a remote island in the Solomons. It became a pure test of logistical capacity, a war of attrition where the side that could land more food, bullets, and aviation fuel would win. Japan failed this test miserably. The Navy lost huge numbers of destroyers and aircraft trying to resupply the starving garrison. The soldiers on the island were reduced to eating roots, lizards, and eventually, reportedly, their own dead. The Japanese logistical chain simply snapped. They couldn't protect their transports from American air power, and they couldn't build airfields fast enough to contest the airspace. By late 1942, the reality of the situation began to penetrate the fog of the General Staff. The Army and Navy, bitter rivals who generally didn't speak, were forced into a grim consensus. They had to withdraw. The evacuation of Guadalcanal in early 1943 was a masterpiece of tactical execution, but it was a strategic admission of defeat. The government euphemistically called it a transfer of forces to a new defensive line, but inside the Ministry of War, the mood was funereal. A former officer later remarked that for the Japanese military, the war effectively ended at Guadalcanal. In September 1943, the Imperial General Headquarters drew a line in the ocean. They established the Absolute National Defense Zone, a perimeter stretching from the Kuriles in the north through the Marianas and Carolines to western New Guinea and the Philippines. The strategic directive was clear. This line must be held at all costs. If the Americans breached this line, the home islands would be vulnerable to direct attack. But privately, the assessments were growing darker. Rear Admiral Soichi Takagi, a brilliant analyst attached to the Naval General Staff, began a study in late 1943 to analyze the war's lessons. He looked at the loss rates of merchant shipping, which were skyrocketing as American submarines began to hunt in wolf packs. He looked at the aircraft production figures, which showed that while Japan was producing more planes than before, the quality was dropping. Further yet, the pilots flying them were barely trained at all, with many only having a dozen hours in the air before deployment. The Americans, meanwhile, were introducing new Hellcat and Corsair fighters that outclassed the Zero, flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of training. Takagi concluded that Japan could not win. He presented his verbal report to Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai and other senior figures in March 1944. His recommendation was radical. Japan should seek a compromise peace immediately, even if it meant giving up its conquests, including Manchuria. This was dangerous talk. The military police, the Kempeitai, were arresting people for defeatism, for saying far less. Takagi's report circulated quietly among senior statesmen who were beginning to believe that Tojo was a madman. The summer of 1944 brought the war to the doorstep of the Japanese ruling class. The American invasion of the Marianas, specifically the island of Saipan, was the blow that shattered the Tojo dictatorship. Saipan was the key to the absolute national defense zone. The army had promised the emperor that it was impregnable, a fortress that would break the American advance. Instead, the Japanese garrison was annihilated. The Imperial Navy made a desperate sortie to save the island, resulting in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. To give you a sense of how badly this went for Japan, this became known to the American servicemen involved as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Hundreds of planes were shot down for the loss of a handful of American aircraft. The disparity in technology and training had become a completely unbridgeable chasm. The loss of Saipan meant that the American B-29 Superfortress bombers were now within range of Tokyo. The theoretical threat of industrial destruction became an immediate, terrifying reality. This forced senior Japanese statesmen to finally make their move, led by former prime ministers like Keisuke Okada and Fumimaro Kono, maneuvered to force Tojo out of the top job. They understood that Tojo, as the face of the war, could never negotiate a peace. He was too committed, too symbolic. This was the man who staked his entire career upon the indomitable Yamato spirit smashing the decadent Anglo-American order. Tojo resisted, trying to reshuffle his cabinet and cling to power, but the loss of confidence was total. He resigned on July 18, 1944. The fall of his cabinet was the first public crack in the regime's facade. Officers in the once elite but now increasingly weakened Kwantung Army and bureaucrats in Tokyo quietly whispered that the war was over. They knew that if Saipan couldn't be held, nothing could be held. Yet the system was paralyzed. The new prime minister, General Kuniaki Koiso, was a compromise candidate, a man without the power to challenge the army hardliners. He was given a mandate not to surrender, but to continue the war in the desperate hope of achieving one decisive victory that would allow Japan to negotiate with honor. This was a delusion that would cost millions of lives across Asia. By February 1945, the American bombers were turning Japanese cities into ash with massive firebombing campaigns. The merchant marine was gone, the factories were starving for raw materials, and the people were beginning to starve for food. Prince Fumimaro Kono, the man who had been prime minister when the war in China began, secured a private audience with Emperor Hirohito. In what became known as the Kono Memorial, the prince delivered a stark and terrifying message to the throne. He told the emperor that defeat was inevitable. That was a foregone conclusion. But he argued that the greater danger was no longer the American military, but the threat of a communist revolution at home. Kono believed that the destruction of the economy and the influence of radical elements within the military would lead to an uprising that would overthrow the imperial system itself. He urged the emperor to sue for peace immediately to save the imperial house before social order collapsed completely. The emperor, however, was not ready to give up. Influenced by the military leadership, he still clung to the hope of a Tennozan, a decisive battle. He told Kono that it would be too difficult to seek peace unless the military achieved one more gain. This rejection sealed the fate of Okinawa. The emperor and the high command decided to gamble everything on the defense of that island, hoping that the bloodletting would be so severe that the Americans would recoil. In April 1945, the Koiso cabinet fell, a casualty of the invasion of Okinawa. Senior officials met to select a new leader who could navigate the ship of state through the coming storm. They chose Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, a 77-year-old hero of the Russo-Japanese War. Suzuki's appointment was viewed with deep suspicion by the army. They feared he would become a Japanese Badoglio. Marshal Pietro Badoglio was the Italian general who had taken over after Mussolini was deposed and had promptly negotiated a surrender with the Allies. The term Badoglio became common in Japanese military circles, a synonym for a traitor who would sell out the nation to save his own skin. The military police kept the Suzuki cabinet under strict surveillance, watching for any sign of quote-unquote defeatism. Suzuki publicly exhorted the nation to fight to the bitter end, declaring that the war had entered a decisive stage where anything but optimism was forbidden. But privately, he knew the game was up. He later admitted that when he saw the B-29s flying over Japan with impunity, he realized that the country had no means to defend itself. His mission, understood by the peace faction, but never spoken aloud, was to find a way to end the war without triggering a military coup that would destroy the government. As the summer of 1945 approached, the Japanese government trapped itself in a final, fatal delusion. The leadership couldn't bring themselves to approach the United States directly since they refused the demand for unconditional surrender. They wrongly believed that this would mean the destruction of the emperor and the potential that he would face a military tribunal. Some even feared that Hirohito could be shipped off to China to face justice for his actions that led to the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese. Instead, these hardliners decided to pin their hopes on the Soviet Union. The Japanese leadership convinced themselves that Moscow would be willing to mediate a peace settlement. They reasoned that Stalin would want to prevent the United States from becoming too dominant in East Asia and might therefore help Japan preserve some of its status. The reality of this delusion was brutally exposed in a series of telegrams between Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo in Tokyo and Ambassador Sato in Moscow. These cables, intercepted and decrypted by American intelligence, provide the most tragic real-time commentary on the Japanese refusal to accept defeat. Togo, under pressure from the military to find a diplomatic miracle, instructed Sato to seek Soviet help. Sato, living in the grim reality of the Soviet capital, fired back with withering sarcasm and desperate realism. He told Togo that the Soviets had absolutely no interest in helping Japan. He pointed out that Japan's proposed concessions, such as returning territories they had already lost on the battlefield, were laughable. Sato eventually confirmed that the Soviets were probably preparing to attack Japan, rather than helping the nation out. Despite this stern and prophetic warning, Sato's words were ignored, and the idea of the Soviet Union as a potential savior bizarrely continued to spread. On July 26, the Allied leaders issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. The alternative, they warned, was prompt and utter destruction with weaponry of untold power. Prime Minister Suzuki, attempting to hold his fragile coalition together, held a press conference where he was asked what his response was. He used a word in Japanese which translates either to treating with silent contempt or simply to withhold comment while contemplating. Two very different meanings. The Allies interpreted this as a defiant rejection. This potential linguistic error provided the final justification to bring down the sun on the land where it rises. The end came with a cascade of shocks that shattered the remaining pillars of Japanese resistance. On August 6, the first atomic bomb obliterated Hiroshima. The Army's initial reaction was denial. They sent a team to investigate, but even before the report came back, the hardliners tried to argue that it was just a powerful conventional bomb. Then, on the night of August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria. This was, in many ways, a greater psychological blow to the military leadership than the atomic bomb. The Army's entire defensive strategy for the home islands relied on the idea that the Kwantung Army in Manchuria was intact and that the Soviets would remain neutral. In a matter of hours, the Red Army sliced through the Japanese lines, revealing that the vaunted Kwantung Army was a hollow shell, stripped of its best units to defend the Pacific. The dream of Soviet mediation, which was the official belief of the hardliners, also died instantly. On August 9th, the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Yet as incredible as it seems, some in the leadership still wanted one more decisive battle before negotiation. In the sweltering, airless bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, the leaders of Japan met to decide the fate of the nation. It was August 9th, and the news of Nagasaki had just arrived. The Soviets were pouring into Manchuria, and the 6 leading figures in the Japanese leadership were split 3 against 3 on what to do next. On the side of peace were Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Yonai. They argued that Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration with the sole condition that the emperor's status be preserved. On the side of war were War Minister Korochika Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Suemu Toyoda. The emperor himself was in attendance, potentially there to break any deadlock, though no one dared to suggest what the emperor should or should not do. Importantly, the emperor was considered a living god in a sense, and the other leaders believed he had the power to speak not as a man, but as a very literal deity. The arguments of the war faction were a chilling reflection of the samurai ethos carried to its logical extreme. They didn't argue that Japan could win. They admitted the situation was desperate, but they insisted that Japan could not surrender without one last battle. They proposed 4 conditions for surrender, with the foremost being the preservation of the emperor and the imperial family. They also demanded no occupation by Allied troops, disarmament to be carried out by the Japanese themselves, and war crimes trials to be conducted by the Japanese government. War Minister Anami went even further, though. He said he was willing to sacrifice up to 100 million people to preserve Japanese honor. That is to say, he wanted the nation as a whole to end itself, rather than admit defeat to foreigners. Anami was no armchair general either, and he would be willing to follow through with his views, regardless of what the emperor said. The debate raged for hours. The cabinet was paralyzed by the requirement for unanimity. Finally, in an act of unprecedented political theater, Prime Minister Suzuki rose and did the unthinkable. He turned to the emperor, who had been sitting silently, and asked him to break the deadlock. Emperor Hirohito was a man who had been briefed on the hopelessness of the war for years, and who had seen the reports from the Total War Research Institute before hostilities. According to the official narrative, the emperor then finally spoke up and gave his decision. Now here I say the official narrative because some historians have questioned whether this version of events was told simply to save the emperor and imperial house, but I digress. He said that the Japanese nation had brought cruelty to the world and had lost, and then he made the Go-Saidan. This was a sacred proclamation, speaking in his status as a god emperor, rather than in his own voice. Simply put, it was an order that was, in essence, heretical to defy. Even then, it was not over. The young officers of the War Ministry, refusing to accept surrender, launched a coup attempt known as the Kyujo Incident. They slew the commander of the Imperial Guard, forged orders, and searched the palace for the recording of the emperor's surrender speech, intending to destroy it. According to the conspirators, they believed that the emperor had been forced to surrender. They burned the home of Prime Minister Suzuki, but the coup failed because the senior leadership of the army, including Anami, refused to join it after the emperor had spoken. General Anami, torn between his loyalty to the emperor and his loyalty to the army, chose the only path his code allowed. On the morning of August 15th, as the emperor's voice was broadcast to the nation, Anami wrote a poem expressing his apologies and faded into history. So that brings me back to the question of when the Japanese knew the war was over, and that ultimately has no single date on the calendar. The Total War Research Institute knew that any war against America was over before it even began. The bureaucrats knew it in 1941. The Navy knew in 1942. The cabinet knew in 1944. The diplomats knew in early 1945. The army itself may not have ever fully accepted it, since they wanted to sacrifice every single person in Japan to preserve their honor. Japan's defeat was a failure of acceptance. The leadership possessed all the data they needed to stop the war years before the bombs fell. They knew the oil was gone, the ships were sunk, and the cities were burning. But the political structure of the imperial state, built on a foundation of spiritual superiority and military dominance, possessed no mechanism for admitting defeat. To admit the war was lost was to admit that the suffering of the people had been in vain, and that the Yamato spirit wasn't superior after all. They fought on not because they thought they could win, but because they couldn't agree on how to lose. In the end, it took the literal vaporization of cities and the intervention of a quote-unquote living God, speaking in what they believed to be the literal voice of God, to break the paralysis. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to 2 of your friends or family members who are interested in World War II history. On the morning of May 24, 1940, the grinding roar of the German war machine, which had been tearing through the French countryside, suddenly fell silent. The vanguard of General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Corps had reached the Eye Canal, a mere 10 miles from the port of Dunkirk. Through their binoculars, German tank commanders could see the spires of the town that offered the last lifeline for the trapped British Expeditionary Force. Complete victory was so close that it was literally visible. The British were reeling, their lines broken, their retreat chaotic, and their French allied armies were cut in two. And yet, instead of the order to attack, the radio crackled with a command that would baffle military historians for decades: halt. For 3 days, the most formidable armored force the world had ever seen sat idling on the heights overlooking the channel, watching as their enemy frantically organized an escape. It's a moment frozen in time, a decision that transformed a certain annihilation into the miracle of Dunkirk, and arguably saved the Allies from total defeat in the Second World War. To understand the halt order, one must first grasp the sheer speed of the German advance that preceded it. The invasion of France, Fall Gelb, had unfolded with a rapidity that stunned even the German high command. General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A had punched through the Ardennes, terrain considered impassable by the Allies, and crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on May 14th. This breakthrough allowed the panzer divisions to race across northern France, reaching the coast at Abbeville by May 20th. This severed the Allied supply lines and trapped the BEF, the Belgian Army, and the French First Army in a giant pocket against the sea. However, this spectacular success bred a deep, gnawing anxiety within the German command structure. The panzers had advanced so fast they'd outrun their infantry support by hundreds of kilometers. To the cautious minds of the older generation of officers, this exposed flank was a nightmare waiting to happen. Their fears were seemingly confirmed on May 21st, when the British launched a counterattack at Arras. Although it was a limited tactical strike involving heavily armored Matilda tanks, it sparked panic and forced Erwin Rommel to use anti-aircraft guns to stop the assault. While the attack failed, its psychological impact was immense. It convinced the German leadership that their armored corridor was vulnerable. Contrary to the popular myth that portrays the halt order as a sudden, erratic whim of the leader, the historical record shows it originated from the military leadership on the ground. On May 23rd, General Günther von Kluge, commander of the German Fourth Army, contacted General von Rundstedt. Kluge's report was grim. His panzer divisions were exhausted. After 2 weeks of continuous combat, mechanical attrition had taken a heavy toll. Some units reported that up to 50% of their tanks were non-operational due to breakdowns and battle damage. Von Kluge suggested a pause to allow the units to repair their vehicles and let the infantry catch up to secure the gains. Rundstedt, who had been watching the rapid advance with growing trepidation, readily agreed. He was a proponent of the classic military doctrine that prioritized the consolidation of territory before the final push. Furthermore, the terrain of Flanders loomed large in their calculations. The area around Dunkirk was a maze of canals and low-lying land that had been reclaimed from the sea. To Rundstedt and von Kluge, this was a potential graveyard for heavy tanks. They believed it foolish to risk their precious armored formations in such unsuitable ground when the war in France wasn't yet won. They proposed holding the armor at the canal line and letting the infantry of Army Group B crush the pocket. It was into this atmosphere of caution that the Austrian arrived at Rundstedt's headquarters in Charleville on the morning of May 24th. When Rundstedt presented his assessment that the tanks should halt to refit for the coming drive south against the French, the leader endorsed it enthusiastically. His own experiences as a soldier in Flanders during the Great War made him acutely wary of the marshy terrain. It wasn't him overruling his generals, as has been claimed in modern myth, but rather a siding with cautious field commanders against aggressive ones. For years, some historians propagated the theory that the Austrian leader halted the tanks as a golden bridge. This was a deliberate political gesture to allow the British to escape, hoping to secure a peace treaty with an Anglo-Saxon empire he admired. This is based upon the verified idea that he saw the English specifically as brothers, and others such as the Scots as cousins. However, modern research has thoroughly debunked this idea. There's no contemporary evidence from May 1940 to support it. In fact, Directive 13, issued the same day, explicitly ordered the annihilation of the Allied forces in the pocket. The goal was destruction, not mercy. The pause was a military decision driven by logistics, terrain, and inter-service politics, not a diplomatic olive branch. The decision to halt the tanks was also fueled by the colossal ego of Hermann Göring. Sensing an opportunity to glorify his Luftwaffe, Göring telephoned his boss and promised that his air force alone could destroy the trapped Allied armies. He argued that the tanks were unnecessary for the finale and should be preserved for the Battle of Paris. The leader, always eager to elevate the highly politically aligned Luftwaffe over the traditionalist Prussian Army officer corps, was receptive. He effectively outsourced the destruction to the Air Force, a decision that ignored the operational realities of weather, pilot fatigue, and the limitations of bombing dug-in troops. This shift in strategy provided the Allies with the one thing they desperately lacked: time. The halt order effectively froze the German armor for 3 critical days, from May 24th to May 26th. During this window, the British and French forces, who had been retreating in disarray, were able to flood into the Dunkirk perimeter and establish a coherent defense. Had the panzers attacked on the 24th, they would have likely overrun the port and the beaches before a defense could be organized. For the German soldiers on the front line, the order was baffling. General Wilhelm von Thoma, a tank commander near Berge, later recounted his frustration at standing on a hill and looking down into Dunkirk through his binoculars. He could see the confusion, the massing trucks, and the defenseless port, yet he was forbidden to move. His tanks sat idle, crews performing maintenance on tracks and engines, while the prize slipped away. Diaries from the period reflect a mix of relief at the respite and confusion at the strategic inertia. They watched the Luftwaffe dive bombers scream overhead, assuming the job was being done, unaware that the sands of the beaches were absorbing the impact of the bombs. On the other side of the line, the pause was perceived as a miracle. British soldier diaries describe a chaotic landscape of burning vehicles and refugees, but crucially, they note the absence of the terrifying German armor. They could see the panzers and knew that they would be decimated if they rolled towards them, but for some reason they just never did. This breathing space allowed discipline to hold. It allowed the Royal Navy to mobilize Operation Dynamo. It allowed the French First Army at Lille to fight a heroic delaying action that tied up 7 German divisions until May 31st, further relieving pressure on the coast. The silence of the panzers allowed the little ships, the hundreds of civilian vessels, to cross the channel on seas that were described as miraculously pond-like. What could have been the biggest disaster in British history became a rallying cry, with the little ships becoming symbols of everyday heroism. By the time the Austrian rescinded the halt order on the afternoon of May 26th, the moment had passed. It took another 16 hours for the German units to reorganize and resume the attack. When they finally rolled forward on May 27th, they didn't face a routed rabble, but a solidified wall of British and French resistance they couldn't break in time. By the time the operation ended on June 4th, nearly 350,000 Allied soldiers had been snatched from the jaws of defeat. When the Germans finally entered Dunkirk, they captured 40,000 brave French soldiers and mountains of abandoned equipment. They had won the battle for France, but they had lost the chance to end the war. The men who waded into the water at Dunkirk would return 4 years later as the spearhead of the liberation of Europe. Interestingly, some historians believe that the British may have been forced to the peace table had hundreds of thousands of soldiers been captured on those sandy shores.